She told him she loved him. He said nothing. 18 months later, he saw her, holding his baby. Alex Stone had always lived his life by a code: discipline, focus, and silence where emotions were concerned. At 35, he had everything society told him he should want. He was a self-made millionaire, the CEO of a tech conglomerate that had disrupted markets and redefined productivity, and he was admired and feared in equal measure by everyone in his orbit. He moved through the world like a force of nature, efficient, clean, composed. There were no accidents in his life, only decisions. At least, that's what he believed until Hannah Gray entered his office and knocked all of that certainty sideways. She was brought on as a media consultant, hired to refresh the company's public voice, young, incredibly bright, and unervingly observant. Unlike most people who sat across from him in meetings, she didn't try to impress him or flatter him. She listened carefully, spoke honestly, and somehow managed to challenge him without ever being disrespectful. That, more than anything, caught his attention. He started calling her into meetings she technically didn't need to be at, just to see how she would respond. She always came prepared, always calm, but with a spark in her that lit up even the most tedious strategy sessions. At first, he thought it was curiosity. Then he realized it was something he had no control over. Their connection didn't unfold with fireworks or melodrama. It was gradual. Late-night work sessions turned into shared dinners. A casual, good job email turned into inside jokes. And then, without either of them realizing how deep the thread had woven, it became something undeniable. For Hannah, it was terrifying and thrilling. For Alex, it was a violation of his most important rule: never mix the personal with the professional. Still, he let it happen, until the moment she said what he feared most. It was after a long, rainy Thursday, the kind that draped the city in gray. They had just wrapped up an exhausting presentation, and she stayed behind after everyone else had left the boardroom. She was nervous, clearly, but composed. She looked him straight in the eye and said quietly, "Alex, I think I love you." He didn't move. He didn't blink. Inside, 1,000 alarms were going off. His chest tightened. His mind spun. But outwardly, he was silent. She waited. Seconds passed. Then more. Still nothing. Finally, she gave a small nod, almost to herself, and said, "Okay. I guess that's all I needed to know." The next morning, she submitted her resignation. She didn't give a dramatic reason, just cited personal clarity and thanked the team. He didn't stop her. He didn't even acknowledge the letter. Instead, he watched her walk out of the building with her box of belongings, head high, eyes forward. He told himself it was the right thing. That he was protecting her. That he wasn't the kind of man who belonged in the world of words like love and forever. But that night, he stood in his penthouse, surrounded by luxury and silence, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Regret. Hannah didn't look back as she left the towering glass building that had been her world for nearly a year. The early autumn air bit at her skin as she stepped out onto the street, her arms wrapped tightly around the cardboard box holding the remnants of her time at Stone Tech. A photo frame, a favorite mug, a pen she'd always kept in her blazer pocket, things that once meant routine, structure, even pride. But now, they felt hollow. She had walked away from a position that many would have fought to keep, from a company with power and prestige. But what she walked away from most was him. She had never planned to fall in love with Alex Stone. At first, he had been nothing more than a high-level name on her email threads, a voice she occasionally heard in quarterly briefings. But when they began working more closely, she saw past the headlines and the intimidating suits. Beneath the polished CEO exterior was a man who, despite being brilliant, seemed constantly at war with his own feelings. He asked for input but hated being questioned. He admired honesty but withdrew from vulnerability. And somehow, in the cracks between those contradictions, she had found herself drawn in. When she told him she loved him, she hadn't been looking for a declaration in return. She hadn't expected a grand gesture. All she had wanted was acknowledgement, something real, something human. But his silence was deafening. It wasn't just that he didn't love her. It was that he didn't even try to understand what her words meant. That silence told her everything she needed to know. So she resigned, not to punish him, but to free herself. She packed quickly that evening and left the apartment she had rented in the city. Her sister, Claire, lived in a quiet town 2 hours north, in a small house surrounded by trees that turned gold in the fall. Hannah had always loved visiting there, and now, it felt like the only place where she could breathe. She drove in silence, her phone on airplane mode, not wanting any last-minute messages or attempts at false closure. Alex wouldn't reach out. She knew that. And even if he did, it would be too late. In Claire's guest room, she unpacked slowly. There was no rush. No meetings. No schedule. Just the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the faint rustle of wind outside the window. She slept for 12 hours straight that first night, exhausted not just from leaving her job, but from everything she had held inside for months. 2 weeks later, her nausea began. At first, she dismissed it, stress, probably, or maybe the change in air. But when it didn't pass, she bought a test. She didn't tell Claire what she was doing. She just locked the bathroom door and stared at the stick in her shaking hands. 2 pink lines. Positive. Her knees nearly gave out. She sat on the cold tile floor for a long time, the test in her lap, tears sliding silently down her face. Not because she was sad. Not because she felt ashamed. But because she didn't know how to feel at all. The weight of the moment was so massive, it flattened every emotion. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her entire life had shifted without warning. She didn't call Alex. She thought about it. More than once. She even drafted a message on her phone. But the image of him in that boardroom, his face perfectly still as she spoke her heart, haunted her. If he couldn't say anything then, what would he say now? Would he believe her? Would he accuse her of trying to manipulate him? Or worse, would he offer cold, contractual support? She didn't want that. Her child didn't deserve that. She closed the message and never sent it. Claire noticed, of course. One night while they were watching a movie, Hannah got up to quietly throw up in the bathroom. When she came back, pale and tired, Claire paused the screen. "You're pregnant, aren't you?" Hannah nodded slowly, lips pressed together. Claire didn't ask who. She just wrapped her in a hug and whispered, "You're going to be okay." In the weeks that followed, Hannah began rebuilding from scratch. She started freelancing from home, copywriting, translating, writing essays under a pen name. It didn't pay much at first, but it gave her purpose. She began prenatal appointments with a kind local doctor and watched as her body changed in ways that felt both terrifying and miraculous. She thought of Alex more than she wanted to. Every time she felt a kick, every time she saw the ultrasound monitor light up, she wondered if he would have been moved. If he would have cried. If he would have pulled her hand to his chest and whispered apologies he didn't know how to give. But she let those thoughts drift away. She had to. Months passed. Her belly grew, and so did her strength. When her daughter was born, after a long and painful labor, the room fell completely silent for a second before the baby's cry broke through. Hannah looked into those piercing blue eyes and knew instantly, there was no denying who her father was. She named her Ellie. No middle name. No last name from him. Just Ellie. Hers. Entirely. Ellie was 5 months old when the world around Hannah finally began to slow down. The chaos of new motherhood, sleepless nights, endless feedings, the dizzying mix of wonder and fear, had settled into a rhythm that was equal parts exhausting and beautiful. The quiet town where Claire lived became their sanctuary. In the mornings, Hannah would carry Ellie outside wrapped in a soft blanket and sit on the back porch with a cup of lukewarm tea, watching as the sun filtered through the changing leaves. Ellie would gurgle and wave her tiny hands at the wind, fascinated by birds, trees, and the play of light on the grass. Claire had converted the small sunroom into a nursery, painting one of the walls pale lavender and adding shelves for the few books and toys Hannah had collected. It wasn't extravagant, but it was warm. Safe. The space smelled faintly of lavender oil and baby lotion, and sometimes, when Ellie napped on her chest, Hannah would close her eyes and pretend the world outside didn't exist. Work was steady enough to get by. Hannah had picked up a few reliable clients and found comfort in her late-night writing sessions after Ellie had fallen asleep. Her pieces were reflective, sometimes raw, and even though she wrote under a pseudonym, they gained traction. Comments poured in from women who saw themselves in her, who had left behind something heavy and were learning to live again. She never mentioned Alex by name. Never told the full story. But pieces of it were there, scattered between lines about heartbreak, silence, and choosing to move forward even when nothing made sense. Despite everything, she didn't regret keeping the pregnancy to herself. She didn't want Ellie to grow up as someone's secret, or worse, someone's guilt. She wanted her to be loved openly and fully. And if that love came only from her, then so be it. Still, there were moments, sharp, quiet ones, when she'd look into her daughter's bright blue eyes and feel a deep ache in her chest. Ellie had his eyes. There was no escaping that. Every time Hannah saw them, it reminded her of the moment she confessed her love and was met with silence. It reminded her of the life they never had, and the man who had let it slip through his fingers. Occasionally, Claire would suggest reaching out, especially during nights when Ellie had a fever or when Hannah looked particularly worn down. But Hannah always shook her head. What if he doesn't want to know, she'd ask. What if he regrets her? Claire never had a good answer. And so, they moved forward together, two sisters and one little girl, building a new version of family. Hannah tried not to Google him, but sometimes she couldn't help it. Alex Stone was still in the news, photographed at conferences, featured in interviews, quoted in Forbes and TechWorld. He looked the same in every photo, precise, polished, cold. She wondered if he ever thought of her. If he ever remembered that night in the boardroom when she'd said 3 words and he'd said nothing. It haunted her, not because she wanted to go back, but because part of her still couldn't understand how someone so intelligent could be so emotionally blind. One late October evening, Hannah bundled Ellie into her softest sweater dress and headed to a local harvest fair. It was a modest event held in the town square with warm cider, pumpkins, and a few booths raising money for local schools and shelters. Claire had been volunteering there and invited her to come help set up. Hannah agreed, thinking it might be good for her to be around people again. The night air was crisp, and Ellie giggled happily in her sling, her tiny hands reaching for string lights and paper lanterns. The scent of cinnamon and wood smoke filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, Hannah felt almost normal. People smiled at her, asked about Ellie, complimented her eyes. Hannah thanked them and moved on quickly. One woman said, "Those eyes, so blue. Just like her father's, I bet." Hannah paused for a fraction of a second. Then she smiled and replied, "She got lucky." That night, after Ellie had fallen asleep, Hannah sat on the floor of the nursery and cried. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't even sadness. It was grief, quiet, private grief, for a connection that could never be, for a man who would never know the sound of his daughter's laugh or the way she furrowed her brow when trying to roll over. And for herself, too, for the part of her that still, even now, wished he had said something when it mattered most. But then Ellie stirred in her crib and let out a sleepy sigh, and Hannah wiped her tears, stood, and whispered, "We're okay, baby. We're more than okay." Because in the absence of what could have been, Hannah had built something whole. Something quiet. Something real. The gala had never been something Alex Stone looked forward to, but he always showed up. As the CEO of one of the most visible and powerful tech companies in the country, he knew public appearances mattered. His team expected him to make the rounds, shake hands with donors, pose for press photos, and deliver a few polished remarks about innovation and philanthropy. He'd done it all before, hundreds of times. Usually, it was effortless. But that night, something about the air felt strange. It wasn't the elegant lighting, the orchestra playing in the corner, or the scent of champagne and wealth that filled the luxurious restaurant. It was something he couldn't name. A restlessness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He walked through the crowd, exchanging practiced smiles, answering questions without truly hearing them, nodding when he was supposed to. His assistant, Dana, tried to keep him moving, whispering names and reminders into his ear. But suddenly he stopped, completely unprompted, turning his head toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She was standing there. Hannah. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this world. Not in this city. Not this close. She stood in a midnight blue dress that clung to her figure with quiet grace, her light brown hair gathered loosely over one shoulder. And in her arms, resting against her chest, was a baby girl no older than 6 months. The child had dark tufts of hair and wide, clear blue eyes, eyes that hit Alex like a blow to the chest. For a moment, the noise around him disappeared. He couldn't hear the music, the chatter, the clinking glasses. He saw only them, Hannah and the baby, framed by the golden lights of the city skyline. Dana said something, but he didn't respond. He walked away from her without explanation and crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps. His mind raced with questions he wasn't ready to form. She hadn't seen him yet. She was gently rocking the baby, speaking to her in a soft voice, completely unaware of the impact she was having just by existing in that space. When he finally reached her, his voice came out quieter than he intended. "Hannah?" She turned. For a split second, there was something raw in her expression, shock, hesitation, and something else that he couldn't name. But it vanished quickly, replaced by calm composure. "Alex," she said evenly, as if they were two acquaintances crossing paths at a grocery store. He couldn't look away from the child in her arms. "She's yours," she said simply, without ceremony, without build-up. "And no, I wasn't going to tell you." It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't bitter. It was just honest. He swallowed hard. Why? Her eyes, those deep brown eyes that once held so much hope, searched his face for a moment. "Because I told you I loved you, and you said nothing. I needed to protect her from silence like that." Alex felt his stomach twist. The weight of what she was saying crashed into him all at once. The silence he had used as a shield back then had become a wall that kept him from his own daughter. He took a breath. "Can we talk somewhere?" "I'm here on invitation from a friend," she said. "This isn't the place." He nodded slowly. "Will you let me see her? Just for a moment?" Hannah hesitated. Then, gently, she adjusted the blanket that covered the baby's tiny body and tilted her slightly toward him. The baby blinked up at him with impossibly blue eyes and yawned. "What's her name?" he asked, stunned by the sound of his own voice cracking. "Ellie," Hannah replied. "No middle name." He reached out instinctively but stopped himself halfway. Hannah noticed and nodded once. "You can hold her," she said quietly. "But not for long." With shaking hands, Alex took the baby into his arms. She was so small. So warm. Her fingers curled around his thumb, and a wave of emotion surged through him so powerfully that he had to close his eyes. In that moment, every late night at the office, every closed-off instinct, every controlled decision, all of it seemed absurd. This child existed. She was real. And he had missed it all. He handed her back carefully, afraid his hands would betray the storm in his chest. "I didn't know," he whispered. "If I had." She cut him off gently. "But you didn't ask. Not once. You never reached out. You didn't wonder what happened after I left. I made peace with that." He wanted to argue. To tell her how often he had thought of her, how many nights he'd stared at her number in his phone, too ashamed to call. But what would that change now? "I'm not here to fight," he said after a long silence. I need time. To process. To understand." "You don't get to process," she said calmly. "You can be in her life, Alex, if you want to be. But only if you show up. Not later. Not when it's convenient. She doesn't need a ghost. She needs presence." He nodded, overwhelmed. "I want to try. If you'll let me." "Trying isn't enough," she said. "But it's a start." She shifted Ellie in her arms and turned away. Before she walked off, she paused, looked over her shoulder, and said, "You know where to find us. But we won't wait." Alex stood there, motionless, as the crowd resumed moving around him. The orchestra played something light and cheerful, and the chandelier sparkled overhead. But his world had shifted. And for the first time in years, Alex Stone wasn't in control. Alex didn't sleep the night after the gala. He sat in his apartment, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows and a skyline that suddenly felt meaningless. The lights of the city flickered far below, but all he could see were her eyes, the way Hannah had looked at him with calm strength, not anger, not desperation, but something worse, finality. And Ellie. That tiny child with his eyes. Her hand had wrapped around his thumb, barely larger than a petal, but that small touch had detonated something inside him that he didn't know how to name. He had spent years building a fortress out of silence, out of logic, out of power. But in that moment, with a child in his arms and a woman he once loved looking through him instead of at him, every defense crumbled. He had been so certain he was protecting her by not answering. He told himself love wasn't real, that his presence would only complicate things. But the truth was more cowardly. He had been afraid. And now, he had missed the first smile, the first laugh, the first time Ellie had opened her eyes. The next morning, he did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He cleared his schedule without reason. Dana protested, confused by his sudden disappearance from meetings and calls, but he didn't explain. There was nothing to explain that could be put into words yet. He found Hannah's name in an old HR file. She had listed her sister's town as a backup contact address. It was a stretch, but it was something. 2 hours later, he was in a car, watching the city give way to long roads, trees, and quiet neighborhoods that looked nothing like the world he lived in. When he pulled up in front of the small house with the white porch, he sat there for a long time, engine off, unsure what he was about to do. He wasn't used to knocking on doors without control, without a reason that benefited him. He wasn't used to being the one asking. Claire answered the door, and for a moment, her expression told him she knew exactly who he was. She didn't smile, but she wasn't hostile either. "She's in the back," Claire said after a long pause. "With Ellie." Hannah was sitting on a blanket in the grass. Ellie was lying on her back, kicking her legs in the air, babbling in soft, happy tones. The sun framed them both, and it struck Alex how complete they looked, how peaceful. He approached slowly, hands trembling in a way that made him feel ashamed. When Hannah saw him, she didn't look surprised. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. I didn't know how not to, he replied. She looked down at Ellie. She doesn't know who you are yet. You're a stranger to her. I want to change that, he said. But not on my terms. Yours. Hers. Hannah studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the edge of the blanket. Sit. He did. For the next hour, he watched her with Ellie, watched how naturally she moved, how she spoke to the baby like she was a whole person with opinions and needs that mattered. When Hannah finally handed Ellie to him again, she stayed nearby but didn't interfere. Ellie didn't cry, didn't resist. She looked at him curiously, her little hand reaching toward his collar. He couldn't stop the tears that welled up. Hannah didn't react. She just watched. You don't get to drop in and out of her life, she said quietly. If you're in, you're in. Diapers, bottles, bedtime stories, sickness, first words. Not just birthdays. I know, Alex said. I'm not here to play a role. I'm here to be a father. If you'll let me. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back on her elbows and stared up at the sky. I don't trust you, she said finally. Not yet. I don't expect you to, he replied. I just hope to earn it. One day at a time. He stayed until sunset, helping fold the blanket, holding Ellie while Hannah packed up her toys. He didn't try to overstay. He didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. When he left, she said only, tomorrow at 10, if you're serious. And he was. He showed up the next morning at 10 sharp. And the next day. And the one after that. He changed diapers with clumsy hands. He learned how to warm a bottle. He held Ellie when she was fussy and learned which song calmed her when nothing else worked. Every evening, when he left, he felt a little less like a stranger. And every night, Hannah sat by the window, watching him go, wondering how a man who once stood so far from love was slowly, steadily learning how to walk toward it. By the third week, Alex had become a part of the daily rhythm, not just an occasional visitor or a curious presence on the edge of their lives. He arrived every morning at 10, no matter the weather, no matter how busy his inbox became overnight. At first, Hannah kept her guard up, watching his every move with quiet skepticism, half expecting him to flinch or retreat when things became inconvenient or emotionally complex. But he didn't. He stayed. He held Ellie through teething cries, paced the floor with her during late-morning fussiness, and patiently learned how to distinguish between the different tones of her babble. His suits began to change. At first, he wore his usual tailored jackets, shirts crisp and perfect. But those soon gave way to soft sweaters, rolled sleeves, jeans with baby drool on the thighs. His hair, once always styled to perfection, grew slightly longer, curling a little at the ends. The change didn't make him look less powerful, it made him look real. Human. Someone Hannah almost didn't recognize. What surprised her most wasn't that he adapted. It was how quickly Ellie responded to him. She started reaching for him when he entered the room, her face lighting up with that gummy, open-mouthed smile that parents come to live for. She squealed when he made silly faces, patted his cheeks when he lay on the floor beside her, and clung to his shirt when he carried her on long afternoon walks through the trees behind the house. There was one afternoon that stood out more than the others. Ellie had just woken from a nap, cheeks flushed, hair sticking out in wild directions. Hannah was preparing a bottle in the kitchen, and when she walked into the living room, she found Alex on the floor with Ellie in his lap. He was softly singing an old lullaby, one she hadn't heard since childhood, his voice quiet and rough around the edges. Ellie's head rested against his chest, tiny fingers curled into the fabric of his sweater. He didn't notice her watching until he turned his head and their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was layered with meaning. That image stayed with her all day and deep into the night. Later, Hannah sat alone on the porch, arms around her knees, and tried to reconcile the man she once knew with the man who now came back every single day. She remembered how it felt to say, "I love you," to him and be met with silence, a wall of distance that had nearly broken her. But the man who came now didn't hide behind silence. He spoke with actions. With presence. With the quiet, undeniable truth of consistency. Still, the wound hadn't fully healed. Part of her held onto it because she didn't know how to let go of something that had changed her so deeply. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't a door you walked through once. It was a hallway you had to choose to keep walking down. That weekend, Alex showed up with a small stack of board books and a toy giraffe. When Hannah laughed and teased him for spoiling Ellie, he looked sheepish. "I didn't know what to bring," he said. "I just wanted to bring something." Then he added, more softly, "I missed everything for 6 months. I can't get that time back, but I can try not to miss what's ahead." That night, after Ellie had gone to sleep, Hannah surprised herself by inviting Alex to stay for dinner. It was a simple meal, pasta, a salad, tea. But it felt monumental. They ate slowly, talked carefully, and for the first time since the gala, she asked him about his life outside of fatherhood. He told her about the company, how it felt empty now, how the money and titles didn't carry the same weight. He admitted he had gone back to the office after the gala and stared at her name in the system for hours, stunned by the hole he hadn't known was there. He confessed that the day she walked out of his life was the first day he questioned the man he had become. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid of love, afraid of needing someone, afraid of not being enough. So I said nothing. And I lost everything." Hannah didn't answer right away. Her heart hurt at the truth of it, but she also felt something else, a flicker of understanding. Not absolution, not yet, but something softer than anger. As he stood at the door to leave, she said quietly, "You're showing up now. And that counts for something." When he left, she stayed at the window longer than usual. And this time, when he disappeared down the street, she didn't feel dread or ache. She felt possibility. October slipped into November with a quietness that matched the shift between Hannah and Alex. The leaves turned from vibrant fire to brittle brown, and the air grew sharper, laced with the coming of winter. But inside Claire's house, there was a strange warmth taking hold, not just from the fireplace or the heavy blankets draped over the furniture, but from the way Hannah had stopped flinching when Alex's car pulled into the driveway, from the way Ellie now squealed when she saw him at the door, from the way the three of them had begun to move together with an unspoken rhythm. Alex had become a constant, no longer proving he could be present, but simply being present. He didn't ask for acknowledgement, nor did he press for more than what was offered. He helped in the kitchen, washed bottles without being asked, stayed late when Ellie had a fever, and sometimes arrived with food already prepared, saying only that he had extra. He had learned to hold the baby with one arm and stir soup with the other, to carry a diaper bag with no sense of irony, and to rock Ellie for long, quiet stretches while humming to himself. The house felt different when he was in it, not louder, not busier, but fuller. More complete. And yet, a part of Hannah remained cautious. She had let herself believe in Alex once and been met with silence that shattered her faith in everything between them. Now, he was here, yes, but for how long? What if the pressure of fatherhood wore on him? What if work pulled him away again? What if this was temporary? Those questions lived in the corners of her mind like shadows she couldn't quite chase away. One evening, while Claire was out and Ellie had fallen asleep unusually early, the house was blanketed in quiet. Alex stayed later than usual. He didn't ask. He just didn't leave. They sat across from each other on the living room floor, Ellie's toys scattered between them, 2 cups of untouched tea cooling nearby. Hannah stared at a small rubber elephant, turning it slowly in her hands. She didn't look up when she said, do you know what the hardest part was? Alex looked at her carefully, sensing the shift in her tone. Tell me, he said. It wasn't when you said nothing after I told you I loved you. That was awful, yes, but I could justify it in my head: fear, shock, pressure. I had excuses ready for you before I even left the building. But the hardest part was the silence afterward. The way you never called. The way you never even tried to ask why I left. That made it real. That told me everything I didn't want to believe about how little I must have meant to you. Her voice didn't tremble. It was steady, quiet, almost detached. That's how he knew it came from the deepest kind of wound, the kind that had bled out and scarred. Alex closed his eyes for a moment. There's not a day that goes by where I don't regret that. She finally looked at him. Then why did you do it? He didn't answer right away. He rubbed his hands over his face and let out a breath. Because I didn't know how to be needed. Not really. I've spent my entire life succeeding by being untouchable. Controlled. But when you said you loved me, I felt completely powerless, and it terrified me. I thought if I said nothing, it would all go away. That the feelings would pass. That you'd move on and forget me. But instead, I lost everything that mattered. And I've hated myself for it ever since. The room felt heavier, but not suffocating. I never stopped loving you, Hannah said after a long silence. Even when I didn't want to. Even when I was angry. But love by itself isn't enough. I need trust. I need safety. Especially for her. I want to build that with you, Alex said, his voice raw. Not because it'll fix the past, but because it's the only future I want. They sat in silence again, this time not out of discomfort, but reflection. Then Hannah said quietly, Ellie's first word might be, Dada, at the rate we're going. Alex smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the mouth but pulled something deep in the chest. I hope it is, he said. Before he left that night, he paused by the door. I love you, he said. No hesitation. No drama. Just the word she had once given him, finally returned. Hannah didn't respond right away. But as the door closed behind him, she felt something shift again, this time not fear, but a small, glowing thread of trust beginning to form. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't closure. It was the beginning of something real. Something neither of them would run from this time. Winter arrived slowly, layering the town in soft snow and fog that rolled over the hills like breath. The trees stood bare, skeletal and still, and the roads shimmered under thin sheets of ice. But inside the little white house, warmth pulsed through every room. It lived in the quiet lullabies Hannah sang at bedtime, in the steam rising from mugs of cinnamon tea, and in the sound of Ellie's giggles bouncing down the hallway like sunlight trapped in sound. What had once been temporary, a man showing up each morning, a father learning how to live outside the boundaries of ambition, was now just life. A shared rhythm. A new normal. Alex had kept his promise. Not with words or grand gestures, but with something far rarer, consistency. He never missed a day, never cancelled, never allowed work to swallow him again. His world had rearranged itself around Ellie's needs and Hannah's boundaries. He still ran a company, still carried the weight of a global empire on his shoulders, but he did it differently now. He brought his laptop to the house, took meetings in Claire's old sewing room, and blocked off time in his calendar for diaper changes and nap time. His employees noticed, the media speculated, but he didn't explain himself. For the first time in his life, he didn't care what the outside world assumed. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, when Ellie wouldn't stop crying and neither of them knew why, when Hannah flinched at a tone too close to the old Alex, or when he caught himself retreating into silence again without meaning to. But those moments didn't end in slammed doors or bitter silences. They ended in apologies, in long walks to clear the air, in small conversations whispered late at night once Ellie had fallen asleep between them. One Sunday morning, as snow fell quietly against the windows, Hannah sat on the couch in thick socks and a worn sweater, feeding Ellie, who was now sitting upright on her own. Alex was in the kitchen making coffee, stronger than Hannah liked, but it had become his ritual. As he moved around, humming under his breath, Hannah looked at him and realized something she hadn't said out loud. She wasn't waiting for him to leave anymore. The fear was still there, a quiet echo in her bones, but it no longer controlled her. He was still here. He had chosen them again and again, not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to. That difference meant everything. That afternoon, Alex took them both to the park. Ellie, bundled in layers of knit and fleece, had just begun taking steps with help, her hands gripping their fingers on either side. She squealed each time her boots crunched through snow, and Alex laughed with a kind of freedom Hannah had never seen in him before. It wasn't the laugh of a man closing a deal or hearing good news. It was lighter. More human. She reached for his arm without thinking, and he looked at her with quiet, hopeful eyes. Later that night, after Ellie had been tucked in and the snow thickened outside, Hannah stood in the doorway of the living room and watched Alex adjust the ornaments on the tree he'd helped them decorate the week before. There was something almost absurd about the way he looked in that moment, this man who had once measured success in acquisition numbers now crouching beside a lopsided tree, wearing socks with tiny snowmen and humming a Christmas carol under his breath. She stepped forward and touched his shoulder. He turned, and she said, simply, "Stay." He blinked, unsure he'd heard her correctly. "Tonight?" "No," she said, her voice calm, certain. "For good." He didn't speak. Instead, he rose to his feet, stepped toward her, and took her hands in his. There was nothing grand in his gesture. No ring. No proposal. Just presence. Just honesty. "I wasn't ready when you gave me your heart," he said. "But I've been ready every day since you gave me a second chance." She leaned into him, and for the first time in what felt like years, there was no weight between them. Months later, on a quiet spring morning, they married in the backyard, surrounded by Claire and a few close friends. Ellie toddled through flower petals in a white dress too big for her and stole the attention from everyone. There was no orchestra, no press, no spectacle. Just promises exchanged under sunlight, and laughter that lingered in the trees. It wasn't the life Hannah had once imagined, but it was real. Built not on perfection, but on brokenness, healed slowly by love that showed up, again and again. And when Alex bent to kiss her hand that night, holding their daughter in his other arm, she knew without doubt that she had not lost anything after all. She had found everything. As the author, I believe the ending of this story is a testament to the quiet power of redemption, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the kind that takes time, consistency, and humility. Alex's transformation wasn't instant, nor was Hannah's forgiveness. That's what makes it real. Love here isn't portrayed as a fairy tale, but as something deeply human, flawed, painful, yet resilient. The story reminds us that some silences hurt more than lies, but also that healing is possible when someone is truly willing to change. Hannah didn't wait for Alex to rescue her, she built a life on her own, and that strength is what made space for them to reconnect, not as who they were, but as who they chose to become. In the end, it's not the grand gestures that define love. It's the everyday presence, the willingness to show up when it's hard, and the courage to believe in second chances. That's why this ending, for all its softness, feels powerful, because it earns its happiness.